I'd like you to close your eyes for just a moment. Close your eyes and imagine that it's 2 a.m, you're sound asleep at home, your mother and father are next door, your siblings are next door, you're all sound asleep, when suddenly you hear a loud explosion outside, you hear a jet aircraft coming very close to your home, and you hear the sound of gunfire in the street. You rush to the window, you see armed men with masks pushing your neighbors into vehicles to take them away, and suddenly your parents come into your room and they say, "Put everything you possibly can into a bag. We have to flee the house right now." Now I'd like you to open your eyes, and as you're fleeing the home, you will soon be joining 125 million people globally who have been forced to flee persecution and war and cross borders to become refugees seeking asylum in another country. What I'd like to do in this TED Talk today is 3 things. Number 1, I'd like to briefly look at the history of my organization, UNHCR, and the international regime for protecting refugees. Number 2, I'd like to look at the current state of affairs globally today and the crises that we face. And then number 3, I'd like to talk about you and me and what you can do potentially to help refugees, to protect refugees, and to empower refugees. So as we stand and sit here today, we are in the epicenter of the tragedy of World War II. And my organization, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, was born from the ashes of World War II. And some of our initial work was helping Polish refugees who were forced to flee and then helping them to return home after World War II. As I'm sure most of you know, the United Nations itself was born from World War II. The UN Charter, the passage of a series of international treaties and laws on human rights, on the rules of war, all with the objective of creating and promoting a system based on rules and multilateralism so that there's peace and security in the world having just experienced a tragedy that Poland so deeply experienced of World War II. If you fast forward to the 1980s in Poland, many of you are aware of Lech Wałęsa and the Solidarity movement and the fight for freedom and democracy. And it wasn't until 1991 that Poland ratified the 1951 Refugee Convention and became part of the international system, the rules-based legal order to protect refugees. And in short, what that means is that if you have a well-founded fear of persecution, or you're fleeing war in the middle of the night, you have the right to seek asylum. And in Poland, as many of you have observed, this very recently happened, unfortunately, with the situation of Ukrainian refugees. Currently, as we are here today, there are 10 million Ukrainians who've been forced to flee their homes. Over 4 million crossed the borders of Poland and received asylum initially. Some moved further west, but today there are currently 1 million Ukrainians who remain in Poland and are receiving protection from the people and the government of Poland. Unfortunately, if we look at the current situation today, as you read the newspapers, we are observing a situation in which all of the things that emanated from World War II, the rules-based order, multilateralism, respect for the rule of law and human rights, are in many instances being set aside or ignored. And you don't have to look very far. You can look to the Russian Federation's full-scale invasion of Ukraine as a prime example of that. You also see every day when you open the newspaper, military troops, Russian Federation forces, targeting civilian infrastructure, targeting civilians themselves, in clear violation of the Geneva Conventions and in violation of humanitarian law. So the situation that we face today is a very complex situation internationally, and part of the reason for that is there is increasingly a disregard for multilateral organizations like the United Nations, or even in some instances the European Union, where we sit here in Europe today. At the same time, we see increasingly that governments and militaries around the globe are ignoring the Geneva Conventions on the rules of law that govern war. As a result, we see an increase in people being forced to flee. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that you had joined at 2 o'clock in the morning when you had to flee your home, 125 million people who are forcibly displaced. I want you just to think about that number. That's roughly the population of Japan, one of the G7 countries, one of the biggest economies and populations in the world, being forced to flee the islands of Japan and suddenly not having a home. 125 million people. If we look just at the Ukrainian situation, there are 4 million people internally displaced, 6 million people who had to cross borders, and that's roughly the size of the population of Greece, a major European country. At the same time, we see a disturbing trend in some capital cities, in some countries, and some governments to increasingly pursue nationalistic agendas, to pursue power politics instead of cooperation and multilateralism. And as a result, unfortunately, refugees are often caught in the middle and have to flee. So the final thing that I want to talk about is you and me, and I want to tell you a little bit about my story, but then I want to also talk to you about things that you can do to assist refugees who have been forced to flee. And there's perhaps no better place to talk about this than the American School of Warsaw, because as I know from the early days, from 2022, of the Ukrainian crisis, many of you in this room were volunteering, and you were working at an American school post to distribute humanitarian aid to Ukrainian refugees. And that commitment to public service, which I think is a big part of the program here, was also a part of my life as a young man. Now, initially, my pursuit of public service led me to the U.S. Marine Corps. I then ended up moving to the Peace Corps, to the U.S. Peace Corps, where I served for some years. And then ultimately, I decided that I wanted to pursue a career in law. I ended up at Georgetown, Washington, D.C., at a refugee law clinic, did an internship at UNHCR in the summer, graduated, had to pay down some debt. It was quite expensive to go to Georgetown. Worked at a law firm for a couple of years and did pro bono work representing asylum seekers in the United States and Washington, D.C. But throughout that entire experience, I increasingly was convinced that what I wanted to pursue as a career was work to protect refugees internationally. And I know a number of you, and Heidi, one of your colleagues, share this interest. She was actually one of our youth ambassadors to the Global Refugee Forum in Geneva a couple of years ago. So I just want to say a few things that I think maybe you can do if you're interested in this type of work, but even if you're not interested in pursuing this as a career, things that you can do. The first thing that I think you can do, and I would encourage you to do, is to be informed and to follow the news and to be aware of what's going on when it comes to the crisis of multilateralism, increasing violations of human rights law internationally, and refugee flows. Here in Warsaw, it's very hard to ignore that because you're sitting right next door to one of the major humanitarian crises in the world. But by being aware and by thinking about these issues, you're not able to vote yet. Those of you at the American school, you're still in high school, but it won't be long. You'll be 18. You'll be able to vote, at least in the United States and probably in other countries where you may vote. And I'm not telling you how you should vote, but when you do vote, hopefully having an awareness of these challenges and having a nuanced understanding of who refugees are and who they are not. They're not criminals or bad people. They're people just like you and me who were forced to flee their homes with nothing but what's in their bag at 2 o'clock in the morning because there were bombs dropping. because people were being loaded into vehicles because of their race or their political opinion or their ethnicity. The second thing I would encourage you to do, and many of you are already doing this here at the American School of Warsaw, is to volunteer. Give some of your time, it may be a few hours on the weekend, to go to the soup kitchen, to go to the American School Outpost that's providing humanitarian aid to refugees, to work at an NGO in your community who's assisting refugees. And then the third thing that I would encourage you to think about is some sort of public service in your career path. Now, I mentioned my career path was not a single career path. I went from the U.S. Marine Corps, very different career path than my current career path, to the Peace Corps, to the practice of law, to Washington, D.C. law firm, and then ultimately to the UN Refugee Agency. But throughout that, in my own personal journey, I was always focused on ultimately how can I achieve public service and work to help others in some fashion. You may not do that as your full-time job. You may pursue a career in banking. You may pursue a career in medicine. You may pursue a career in accounting or in business. But there's always scope within your professional fields to not forget public service. And I think that in closing, this would be my main message. And I think it's a message that very much resonates with the American School of Warsaw, the ethic, the motto, the creed of the school. And that is that this is not just about academics and pursuit of professional advancement in the future, but it also has to be about the pursuit of public service. On that note, I'll conclude my TED Talk, and thank you very much.